6 days ago, as cadaver dogs were discovering dozens of dead bodies in destroyed communities across the Southeast in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, and as hundreds of thousands of people went without essentials like food and water and power, Kamala Harris wasn't overseeing any of those disaster relief efforts. She wasn't holding round-the-clock meetings at FEMA headquarters or the White House Situation Room. Instead, as American citizens drowned in their own homes, Kamala Harris was busy taping an episode of the popular sex and relationship podcast Call Her Daddy, which is hosted by a 30-year-old woman named Alex Cooper. Now, we've said a lot about the administration's indifference and callousness to the communities devastated by this storm. Every day there's a glaring new sign of just how little they care about American citizens who are dying. Just this weekend, for example, the DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, who oversees FEMA, was spotted shopping in Georgetown for high-end menswear. This was right after he announced that FEMA's out of money, which is something that he assured us wouldn't happen as recently as this summer. Meanwhile, on Saturday, whoever is running Kamala Harris's social media accounts announced that we're going to spend $150 million on providing food and shelter and humanitarian assistance, but it's not going to Americans in states like North Carolina or Tennessee. Instead, the money's going to Lebanon, a country full of people who hate us. So it's safe to say that when it comes to displaying incredible levels of callousness and incompetence and worse during a crisis, this administration has been working overtime. But with this interview on the Call Her Daddy podcast, Kamala has demonstrated that however low the bar is with this administration, it can always get lower. And first of all, before I get into the specifics of this interview and what an unmitigated disaster it was in so many ways, we should acknowledge we could see the political reasoning behind it, even if I don't think that it will have the effect ultimately the campaign intended. But this is part of a strategic shift in the Kamala campaign, as David Axelrod pointed out the other day. This week, probably because her internal poll numbers look really bad, worse than we even realize, Kamala's going to be appearing on a bunch of friendly shows with left-wing hosts, entertainment-style shows. Stephen Colbert, Howard Stern are two of them. But very few personalities have the reach of Alex Cooper. It's an extremely popular podcast with young women. We talked about it during the Daily Cancellation a few weeks ago. And that's why Cooper just signed a contract worth $125 million. But that fact by itself says something very troubling about young women in this country. And I think that's also a conversation that we should have, because we're always talking about men and how troubled we are by young men and what's happening with young men. But for all the grief that we give men about the kinds of role models they choose, manosphere influencers, etc., all the porn they watch, and all of that, there should be just as much scrutiny on the young women who have made bimbos like Alex Cooper into huge stars. And that's what Alex Cooper is. She's a degenerate fourth-wave feminist who hid her engagement with her now husband from her own audience so that she could continue selling them on a lifestyle of self-destructive, empty, sex-crazed nihilism, which naturally entails raising their all-important quote-unquote body count. This is a podcast that teaches women to wield sex like a weapon and to sacrifice their dignity in the process. And in that sense, at least, Kamala actually makes perfect sense as a guest. There's a very strong argument to be made that her body count back in California is the reason she's now the Democrats' nominee for president. So she's the perfect fit for a podcast that just 2 episodes ago, before the sitting vice president appeared, did an hour-long episode on the topics of, quote, hall passes and frat daddies. So here's a couple of excerpts from that episode, or at least the parts of it we can air, which we can't air most of it, but here's just a little bit of that.
My mom, as like a gift, sent me the Jersey Pottery Barn teen sheets, and I was like in flames when I woke up. I thought I had the flu.
So I remember I got like these dark gray ones.
Yeah.
And the first time a guy my sheets, and I only had, again, one pair.
Yeah,
so I was just
one pair.
looking at that like, damn, and I just left
like
it there.
a credit card that later on after the had dried and you were like trying to scrape it off. You were like, we'll just get that off at the end.
Something that you talk about in your stand-up special that had me cackling. Well, 2 things. We have to talk about 2 things. One is because...
love him and hate him.
Sweetie.
Mm-hmm.
The way that you described heading downtown to the...
Yeah.
And seeing the and approaching it.
There is a goofy down there.
It is.
Yeah.
But it works if you like swirl your tongue in there a little. Like,
oh yeah.
Oh, it's a little.
If you don't get in that, they're not getting in yours, and we all know this.
Give them a little surprise attack.
But I never try and go for the other.
So did you catch that? I mean, we had to bleep like half of it. So, I mean, I think it's enough for you to basically get the idea. And this, again, is 2 episodes ago. Right before the Vice President of the United States is sitting down for a conversation. And what you just heard there is actually pretty tame by the standards of this podcast. They have another episode called Welcome to Slut Camp. And, I mean, you can imagine what Slut Camp entails. I can't play any of that, but there's no need to. And to be clear about the context here, this is the second most popular podcast in the world after Joe Rogan. It's by far the top podcast among young women, but they're not talking about interesting or intellectual topics like Joe Rogan does. Okay, you're probably not going to go on, you're not going to tune into the Alex Cooper Call Her Daddy show to hear, to hear from, an Amazon explorer or someone debating the moon landing, like you will with Joe Rogan, which are at least interesting topics. Instead, you get this inane, just absurdly vulgar, lobotomized nonsense. And it's a show aimed at turning young women into very stupid and depraved hedonists. An emphasis on very stupid, which is why every second you spend listening to this filth causes your IQ to depreciate exponentially. Just preparing for this show, as I watched some of these clips, including the ones we're about to play with Kamala in them, I could feel my brain cells melting away like candle wax. And which is why, I mean, not to spend too long on this point, but this is a good thing for any young men out there if you're in the dating world and you happen to find yourself dating a young woman who is a professed fan of this podcast. Just turn and walk away. Don't even bother. Just, you could break up over text message. This is not a woman who's even worth talking to, honestly. Any woman who enjoys sitting and listening to this podcast is not high enough quality if you're a young man. I mean, that's really how bad it is. And we have no problem talking this way about men who enjoy media of a similar type, but on the other end of the spectrum. We have no problem saying that about them. So it should be equal for the other side of the equation. And that brings up the question of why any presidential candidate, even one as dumb and immoral as Kamala, would want to appear on this podcast. I mean, normally when you're running a presidential campaign, you give interviews to a wide array of outlets. You don't limit yourself to vapid influencers who make a living talking to celebrities about oral sex. So why is Kamala doing that exactly? As it happens, Alex Cooper asked Kamala Harris that very question, and Cooper got this word salad in response. Listen.
I'm curious, you don't do too many long form interviews. What made you want to do Call Her Daddy today?
Well, I think you and your listeners have really got this thing right, which is one of the best ways to communicate with people is to be real, and to talk about the things that people really care about. I mean, what I love about what you do is that your voice in your show is really about your listeners. And I think especially now, this is a moment in the country and in life where people really want to know they're seen and heard and that they're part of a community, that they're not out there alone. And so I'm really glad to be with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time.
You've got this thing, right? Says the Democrats' nominee for president of the United States. She says this podcast is real because they talk about things people care about, like hall passes and frat daddies. Still not sure what a frat daddy is, by the way, and I don't really care to know. In other words, according to Kamala, Americans don't care about inflation or drowning in their own homes after a hurricane or the possibility of World War III breaking out in the Middle East. They care about listening to bimbos talking about sex. And to that end, most of the conversation on this podcast involving two childless women was about abortion, of course. Kamala Harris repeated the familiar lie that Georgia's heartbeat law somehow killed a woman, when in fact the abortion pill killed that woman. Kamala also lied about Tim Walsh's support for allowing children to die after they survive abortions, even though it's well documented that children are in fact being left to die in hospitals in Minnesota. And listening to all of this, it's clear that the campaign sees abortion, of course, as the single most important issue in this election. And it's not hard to see why they think that. Abortion destroys families, which are the greatest obstacle to increased government power. People with families are loyal to their families, not to imbeciles in the federal government like Kamala. The other obvious benefit of talking about abortion in the context of this podcast is that it's a safe topic for Kamala. Kamala doesn't really have to think on her feet very much. She can use the canned talking points that she's memorized, and she knows that her audience will be receptive to them. So here's just one of those moments where Kamala Harris called back to a line that she used during the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, and here it is again. Listen.
I want to pose this question more to you and the Daddy Gang, but one of the biggest conversations in this year's election revolves around a woman's body.
Yep.
I want to take a moment, and can we try to think of any law that gives the government the power to make a decision
I know what you're going to ask.
about a man's body? Let's
No.
just pause.
No.
Is there any law?
No. It's no. Look, we are a work in progress. But here's one of the many things I so love about our country. Part of the strength of our country and our evolution as a country has been through the fight for the expansion of rights. Not the restriction of rights, but the expansion of rights. And we still have work to do. But I say that work is born out of love of country. And it's hard work, but it's good work, and it's important work. And that's what's before each of us. And I think that, around election time, but every day, back to the conversation that we've been having about power, the beauty of a democracy is that we each as individuals have the power to weigh in on this.
Yeah, we want to expand rights. We want to expand rights by entirely removing all human rights from a whole entire subset of the human species, which are unborn children. That's how we expand rights. But what we heard at the beginning there is this very familiar line that there are no laws that apply to male bodies, apparently. This is a line that the Kamala campaign is obviously very fond of, which is concerning because there are about a dozen reasons why it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. First of all, we do have laws that apply exclusively to male bodies. The biggest one is the Selective Service Act, which requires the overwhelming majority of men to sign up for the draft. The law literally refers to male persons, not women. It says male persons in the law. And that's not a small thing, since it's led to the deaths of a lot of men. In Vietnam alone, something like 11,000 men were drafted into service. And then on top of that, we have divorce laws, which are extraordinarily biased towards women and against men in various ways. So just as a basic factual matter, the talking point is just wrong. And there's an even more fundamental point to make, which is that all laws, by definition, control the bodies of all human beings who are subject to them. Okay? I mean, this might be too philosophical of a point for these two ladies to grasp, but every law, any law that exists, controls the bodies of everybody who is under that law. So, a law against stealing, for example, is a law that controls your body, controls my body. Because of that law, I'm not allowed to use my arms to draw a gun inside of a bank. I can't use my mouth to scream, "Give me all your money." I can't use my legs to run away with a bag of cash. That's a law that controls my body. It tells me something I'm not allowed to do with my body. In fact, literally every law that exists in this country tells me what I am and am not allowed to do with my body. That's every law. So using the terminology of pro-abortion activists, my body is being controlled in these scenarios. So if we're going to get rid of abortion bans because they control women's bodies, then we need to get rid of every other law on the books, because all of them are intruding on your freedom to do whatever you want with your own body, which, as we learned during COVID, of course, isn't something that any of these people actually care about anyway. But even within the fantasy realm that left-wing activists have constructed for themselves, the talking point still doesn't make any sense. I mean, these are the same people who have told us for years that men can get pregnant. Men and women are not distinct categories in their worldview. That's supposedly the official consensus position of every Democrat and all of their, the discredited scientific journals that they like to refer to. So under that view, abortion laws would in fact apply to men, specifically quote unquote trans men, who we're told are no different from normal men. What happened to that? Did Alice Cooper and Kamala Harris just forget all about the existence of quote unquote trans men? Is this trans erasure? Is this trans genocide that they're conducting right now? Or are they finally acknowledging that men can't get pregnant, even if these two are too dumb to realize what they just said? Sure seems like it. So where's the human rights campaign? Where are the trans activists screeching on social media informing us that Kamala Harris just genocided millions of trans men by denying their lived experience? They're all silent, strangely enough, and we know why. They all know that men can't actually get pregnant, and that this is a category that doesn't actually exist at all. And it's all an obvious lie that's maintained by activist organizations that are really just front groups for the Democrat Party. And the thing about lies is that sometimes they're hard to keep straight. Sometimes you slip up, and that's what Kamala Harris and Alex Cooper just did. And that's not even the biggest problem with the talking point, which is that abortion laws do not, in fact, control a woman's body. They control what she is allowed to do to someone else's body. Laws that permit abortion, in fact, give women absolute power over the bodies of their children, to include their male children. And that means that pro-abortion laws are, in fact, laws that govern what can be done to the male body. But like all dumb narcissists, Alex Cooper and Kamala Harris never pause to consider the substance of what they're actually saying. It never occurs to them that their talking points could be wrong, so they just repeat them over and over again. And while they do it, they make sure to point out how enlightened they are and how dumb men are by comparison. Here's just one of those moments. Listen.
To put it in our TikTok terms, I have seen girls on the street walk up to men and be like, do you know where a tampon goes? Right. Do you know how many tampons we use? Do you even know do you know what a X or Y or Z is of a part of our, and they don't know the answer.
I was the first vice president or president to ever in office go to a reproductive health care clinic, ever.
In retrospect, there's one way that this podcast could have been at least somewhat entertaining, but they can't do it with Kamala Harris as the guest. That was the mistake. The guest could have been Tim Walz. That would have been worth watching. He could have talked all about his law requiring that high schools, stock the boys' bathrooms with tampons. He could have gone into great detail about how much he knows about tampons and how teenage boys can benefit from them and where exactly they're supposed to put the tampons. But none of that happened, unfortunately. So we're stuck with Alice Cooper and Kamala Harris saying that men are idiots because they apparently provide unsatisfactory answers when women randomly stop them in the street and ask, do you know how many tampons we use? First off, if a random woman asks you that question on the street, they are obviously the weird ones in that interaction. That's a situation where you should, keep on walking and not make eye contact unless it's absolutely necessary. And by the way, if you're one of these women apparently stopping men on the street to ask that question and they're not answering and they're walking away, it could be they don't know the answer. It could also be that they don't want to talk about this, you freak. And also, by the way, just so you know, why should any man know how many tampons you use? Why would you want them to know that? No, that's not information anyone should know, because you should keep that to yourself. Okay, you shouldn't be talking about that publicly. That's disgusting. And also, if the standard is that people should be educated about topics that don't directly apply to them, or else they're morons, then I have some very bad news for Alex Cooper and Kamala Harris, because both of them are complete morons by that standard, or by any other standard. Kamala Harris doesn't even understand the economic policies that she's proposing, even though she's had several months to figure it out. And that became clear in the span of this 45-minute friendly podcast interview. Here's just one example. Listen.
Which is why another thing that I'm really focused on is small businesses and startups, and giving startups a $50,000 tax deduction, because right now it's $5,000 and you can't start up any small business with $5,000.
Now, from the sound of it, Kamala Harris thinks that a tax deduction is like an investment in the business, a check that gets cut, like seed money. She says no one can start a business with $5,000, so she'll give businesses $50,000 instead. But that's not what a tax deduction is. A tax deduction reduces the amount of income that businesses pay taxes on. Nobody's expecting anyone to start a business with the $5,000 tax deduction. The point of the deduction is to help businesses once they've brought some income in. So Kamala's plan would allow businesses to pay less tax if they're generating more than $5,000 in income. That's the plan. Unfortunately, Kamala is incapable of explaining this in plain English or even understanding what her own plan is. Instead, she's repeated this exact talking point in every recent interview she's done, starting with Oprah. Every single time she says that no one can start a business with $5,000. She uses that exact formulation verbatim, and at no point does she demonstrate any understanding of what a tax deduction actually is, even the specific tax deduction that she is proposing. And none of the interviewers ever ask her about it because they probably don't know what a tax deduction is either. I don't think that Alice Cooper was probably capable of going back and forth in any about tax policy. So she probably can't even spell deduction. But anyway, that doesn't matter because they do know what tampons are. And apparently that's supposed to be extremely impressive. People whose homes were just destroyed in North Carolina are supposed to watch interviews like this and elevate Kamala Harris to the presidency. People who can't afford groceries are supposed to feel seen and reassured by the promise that as bad as things get, they can take solace in the fact that Kamala Harris and her running mate are both tampon experts. That's the message of joy and empowerment that Democrats are now pushing. They're courting audiences that listen to Call Her Daddy and Howard Stern. They're betting that this is the level of discourse or lack thereof that most female voters are capable of. It's an entirely degrading way of thinking about your own voters. And as you can tell very clearly from Kamala Harris's appearance on this podcast, it's a way of thinking that dulls the mind. People who only think about themselves aren't capable of having interesting conversations. They're not capable of coming up with ideas that help anyone else. They're not even capable of feigning empathy as hundreds of Americans die in the wake of one of the worst hurricanes in American history. They're only capable of seeking out new ways to empower themselves. The more depraved and grotesque, the better. That's what Kamala Harris has done throughout her entire political career. It's a big part of why she's hated even in her own home state of California. She preaches empowerment as a transparent way of empowering one person, herself. And now, with less than a month to go until Election Day, maybe out of desperation, or maybe because she truly can't help herself at this point, Kamala Harris has finally stopped pretending otherwise. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.